All right, everybody, hello and welcome to this episode of Boss Cranky's Coding Camp. I am the one and only Boss Cranky. Today, we're going to take a break from coding. I never thought I'd say that, but we're going to talk about one of the pitfalls associated with agile development that I've run into, and that is story point abuse. Whether you and your team are just beginning your agile practice or are seasoned practitioners, you have probably used story points, t-shirt sizing, or something similar to estimate effort. That seems innocent enough, but without a bit of vigilance on your part, story points can end up abused. And I promise I'm not just going to read this script. It's going to be close, though. We're going to have other stuff in here, too. I do admit that abuse is kind of a strong word. Technically, you aren't abusing story points, though you are misusing them. You are abusing your people and hindering your company's overall objectives. You don't have to believe me, because we're going to do a deep dive here and go through at least a few examples and kind of illustrate what I'm talking about. Note that while this will assume some basic knowledge of agile terms and principles, I'll touch on some definitions as we go. You'll also find some links in the description that'll illustrate some of the things we're talking about here. I've been in several agile shops over the years, and I've encountered story point abuse more than once. Listen, I like agile. I think it brings a lot of good things to the table. That said, there are some errors I have witnessed that hamper organizational success. To state the obvious, these are more errors of execution than problems with Agile itself.
Listen, I said I like Agile, but despite what the zealots preach, it ain't magic. Agile is not some sort of hot tub time machine, and that is, it doesn't allow you to tear a hole in the space-time continuum, step through that hole, manipulate said time and space, and somehow make everything compressed and get more done in less. It just don't work like that.
Okay, so let's talk about story points and what we really mean by that. Story points are an estimate of relative difficulty associated with a given feature provided by and for a specific team. So in a little more detail, a given agile team will provide sort of a gut feel for a specific feature. This gut feel is based on their skill, knowledge level, confidence in the understanding of the feature, the tech platform, tools available to them, the team's history together, a whole slew of factors. So this gut feel will be assigned a relative value, and that value is referred to as story points. You know what? That's a decent real-world working definition in my experience.
I know some of you don't want to hear what you don't want to hear, so let me emphasize some stuff. That was an estimate of relative difficulty, yada, 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 by and for a specific team.
Now, over time, that is multiple sprints, you can kind of sort of maybe get a feel for the velocity of a specific team. Simply said, velocity is the average of the story points completed in previous sprints. Said average can provide some very general idea of how many features a specific team can deliver in a given sprint. So I know what you're thinking now, right? That's great. That's awesome. Story points do sound like a good way to acknowledge that we don't know everything, but also recognize that we need to make progress. As long as we understand that points are relative to a specific team, we will be fine. That last part is where things start to break down. Okay, we've talked about story point abuse, but what's that really mean? Well, in my experience, there are two ways that story points are abused. The first way is that story points are used to compare different teams. And the second way is that story points are used as an individual performance metrics. Let's talk about that first case for a moment. Using story points to compare two groups is like trying to compare apples and giraffes. It just doesn't make any sense. Think about it. You're trying to directly compare guesstimates from different people at different skill levels, implementing different features with different tools. For clarification and to consider a concrete example, let's assume that Team X has a velocity of 20 and Team Y has a velocity of 10. Despite the fact that 20 as a number is twice as much as 10, this tells us nothing comparative. I know it is tempting to think that Team X is twice as efficient as Team Y, but that won't work here. Because, why? Story points by definition are sort of fuzzy. What one team calls 3 story points, another team may think of as an 8 or as a 2. There's nothing wrong with this. That is exactly how story points are intended to work. This comparison really only tells us that the two teams use different scales. Team X uses the apple scale, Team Y the giraffe scale. Well, okay, that's the most hopeful and innocent explanation at least. There may be other, less desirable explanations that we will get to in a bit.
Now, you would think that even the managers and directors and etc. out there should be able to realize that comparing apples and giraffes just won't work. I've seen things, brothers and sisters. I have seen things out there.
Story points don't work as an individual performance metric for similar reasons. Let's consider an example here. Let's assume that your team uses story point poker, also known as planning poker, to estimate feature effort. Further, let's say in this case that there are 5 people on the team, and for a given feature, the team shows cards that look like this. Sorry, the deck of cards I had handy actually had 20 instead of 21. It should be 21. Just forgive me on that. So with these cards showing, it's likely that the negotiation will bring this to like an 8 story point story, maybe a 13. So everybody trucks along like, okay, it's all good. That sounds fine. As long as the person that said 21 doesn't get assigned the feature. Well, guess what? The sprint starts, and that's exactly what ends up happening. Normally, this is not a problem because good, high-performing teams will work together to sort it out. But if you, as a leader/manager, are using story points as an individual performance metric, then you are going to punish the person that understands this feature the least. They told you at the beginning they didn't understand the feature, and now you're going to be beating them up for being honest. Don't do this to your people and your company.
Saying that a little bit differently, don't punch down on your people. Punching down is tyranny. Punching up is truth to power.
Story points just don't work for either of these purposes, neither for comparing two teams nor as an individual performance metric. I recommend developing legitimate performance evaluation, growth, and feedback processes to solve this problem. Okay, so these two misuse scenarios share a key trait. That is, that they indicate you are trying to apply a manufacturing mindset to a knowledge work environment. That's wrong for a lot of reasons, but specifically because you still cannot compare apples and giraffes. Listen, a lot of authors have written on this subject over the years, so I'm not going to elaborate too much here, but the takeaway is the same. It still won't work.
He won't elaborate, brothers and sisters, but I will. We ain't making widgets here. Everything we do is likely a little bit different than the previous thing. So, all you bosses out there, quit thinking about a dang assembly line.
Okay, so I'm sure you're asking yourself, what's the bottom line here, Boss Cranky? What's the net of all this? Well, there's a couple of things that immediately pop into my head. The first problem is that you're basing any assumptions on bad data if you use story points in either of the ways mentioned here. That means that you are evaluating your people, both as individuals and as teams, inaccurately, and thus hurting your company's efforts. Listen, I know from firsthand experience that employee evaluations are tough. It really would be helpful to have an objective measure to use in that regard. Story points, by their very nature, will not work for that purpose. Do not try to use them like that. Second thing, you are teaching your teams to lie to you. In fact, you're rewarding them for doing so. The teams will eventually determine that the people with the most story points completed get the kudos, the perks, the benefits, etc., get the praise, bottom line. At best, the teams independently begin to up their estimates. Tasks that would have previously been 3 story points become an 8. Items that were 13 story points previously will likely become a 21 or 34 or maybe even higher going forward. That's at best. At worst, your teams start working together to game the system. That is, they lie to you in a concerted, synchronized fashion. True, your teams are working together now, but it is not in a way that you really want. This qualifies, by the way, as one of those previously mentioned less desirable explanations. So to wrap this up, use story points as they were intended, only for estimates of an individual team's capacity at any given time. That's all they are intended to represent.
I may have given you all the impression that bosses piss me off. Well, to be honest, sometimes they do. But it ain't just bosses. any unqualified individual that makes their way up the ladder, they qualify for getting the side eye from Boss Cranky. And listen, I get it. Everybody wants a seat at the table, right? Well, I can't promise you a seat, but I can guarantee you I can get you a chair. Hang on just a minute. Come over here. Where'd I put that sucker? Here it is right here. I tell you what. Now what I do is I say, I ain't got you a seat, but you can have this chair.